The traction gap framework is really broken into three distinct phases. And so this go-to-market phase is the traction gap, and it's in this traction gap that roughly 85% of all products, all startups fail. And the fundamental reason for that failure is generally, as we talked about earlier, not due to product engineering issues. It's generally due to lack of market engineering skill within the team.
Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on what it takes to break through that business inertia and propel you and your business forward. I'm your host, Connie Steele. It takes guts, determination, and a healthy dose of optimism to attempt building a startup of your own. And even with that passion to innovate, inspired by a dedication to change or improve the way we do things, the unfortunate reality is that most startups fail. So the big question is why? And more importantly, what's the difference between those that fail and those that succeed? What's the secret to success? Bruce Cleveland is a founding partner of Wildcat Venture Partners and author of the book Traversing the Traction Gap. He's had a front row seat into understanding what's required in taking an idea from startup to category leader, with over 3 decades of experience building early and growth stage companies in Silicon Valley, all before becoming a venture capitalist. And as an investor, he's been involved with some exciting companies, including Marketo, C3, and Vlocity. What compelled Bruce to write his book was to answer that very question around why the startup failure rate was so high and what entrepreneurs could do about it. We'll start with a view into his career journey during his early startup days in Silicon Valley, with some high-profile companies that you might be familiar with.
I started in the Valley several years ago, working for a very small startup with a pretty interesting idea and a pretty provocative CEO by the name of Larry Ellison, and the company, of course, Oracle. Back then, it was this is 1985, and I think Larry had a lot of really large ideas, which actually became true. But we were a small company located on Sand Hill Road. We had about 100 people, so still pretty small compared to where Oracle is now. But that's where I got started. I worked for a guy named Tom Siebel, and I helped to create the Unix product line division for Oracle. Back then, Oracle was structured around operating systems and different operating systems that it ran on. So, and I built the Unix product line division along with some engineering counterparts. So that's kind of where I got my start in Silicon Valley. From there, I went on to a company that I think we all know called Apple. Mm-hmm. And I ran several different engineering divisions there, primarily focused on object technology work that Apple was working on at the time. In 1996, early 1996, late 1995, Tom Siebel called me up and said, "Hey, we've got this company that we've put together. It seems to be working. Seems to have some promising outlook." And that was Siebel Systems, which was the founding company for the customer relationship management market. I joined Tom in April of 96. We IPO'd actually just a couple of months later. We went from that around $4 million in revenue to around $2 billion in revenue over the next 5 years, from a few, maybe less than 100 employees to, 8,000-9,000 employees. I think it's still one of the fastest growing, if not still the fastest growing company in U.S. history. It was at the time. I'm not sure it retains that title today. I did a number of things for Tom. I ran marketing. I ran and built the Alliance program, its partnering program. And then ultimately, I held the role of, we didn't call it Chief Product Officer, but that's what it was, running all products for the company. And that was a pretty interesting time. In 2006, we sold the company to Oracle for about, I guess it was around enterprise value about $6 billion. And while Oracle offered me a role, I didn't really want to go back. I think the company had maybe 100,000 or more people at the time. And that just wasn't something I was necessarily interested in doing.
Even with all the accomplishments and successes that Bruce achieved and being sought after to serve in other corporate leadership roles, he still had this desire to continually learn and try new things, which ultimately led to another career pivot.
So I chose to try something I had never been involved in before, which was venture capital. And so I really didn't know venture capital, but I thought it would be interesting to take my product background and put that to work as an investor. Something I didn't know, something that would be interesting to learn. And so I joined a small firm, strangely enough, located in the exact same small few offices that Oracle had been located, where it had been located on Sand Hill Road back in the early 80s. And that was focused on building and investing in early stage ideas or startups that existed using this software as a service business model. And that was really kind of nascent back in 2006. There were a few firms, maybe Bessemer, a couple others, Emergence, that have focused in this area. But it was really pretty much a still to be seen business model. And invested in an idea that became that was a company that became a market-leading company called Marketo, which was acquired by Adobe last year for almost $5 billion. Other companies like Workday, and that maybe some of your audience have heard of, but maybe companies that they haven't heard of that I think are up and coming, like C3.ai, Doximity, Vlocity. These are all companies that when I invested were mostly at the ideation or just past the ideation stage that have now become billion-dollar plus, at least valued companies. So been a pretty interesting ride doing all that. And that led me to, a few years ago, partnering with two other people to create Wildcat Venture Partners. They came from a venture firm that was winding down. I came from a venture firm that was winding down. And we had fairly interesting backgrounds. We're all former entrepreneurs ourselves, or we either founded or were members of teams that founded companies that went on to become, multi-billion dollar outcomes, focused primarily in the business software space. And we decided to build an early stage firm that focused on not doing the things that we had done poorly before, but doing the things that we had done well.
Learning from your mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. And two people I had known for many years. So it made a lot of sense. And so we actually became a startup, venture firm, and put together our first fund. We've now invested that and are in the process of raising our second fund.
What's been so interesting is that you really have worked in all stages of businesses and have, in terms of roles, worked in almost every facet of a business. So you have a very holistic view of how things operate and operate well together, and can see things from a strategic lens, but also an operational lens as well. So you're able to connect the dots in so many different ways that maybe others may not have.
Yeah, the interesting part that I've learned about venture capital is that most of the people involved have never held a product role. I've never built a company from ideation to, and gone through the many stages. Many have invested in companies that have done well, but most venture capitalists have not been founders or members of teams and have gone through all the phases that companies need to go through. I guess I'd be worried if I hadn't done those things, investing in early stage concepts, basically. In these early stage companies, there's no spreadsheets that we can analyze, to take a look at whether this company is going to be successful. And I know if I didn't have the background in building and delivering products to market, it would certainly make me a lot more nervous around, what we do, at least as an investor. And it probably explains some of the reason why a lot of venture firms have moved to what I would classify as more later stage. They're not late stage, but they're later stage, where they want proof and evidence of market, that there's a market, and that the product works and the team's relative together. The net of all that is, for each of us, me and my partners, we because we've been part of the creation of companies and have been members of operating teams in those companies, I think it gives us maybe a little different insight, a little different perspective, something maybe that many other firms, not all of them. I mean, there are definitely firms with people who have operating experience, but I'm not just talking about being a product manager. I'm talking about being the founder or the founding member of the team and building that into a multi-billion-dollar outcome, and not just in valuation, but in revenue, which I think, these are large companies with large organizational problems, et cetera. And I just know for myself, having that as a personal background, and I know for my partners as well, I think it makes the decision processes, I don't know about easier, but it certainly lets us sort of look at multiple facets of the decision.
Having worked across all stages of a business, coupled with roles as a strategist and operator in various functions, gave Bruce a unique lens from an investor perspective. And it's been these experiential lessons learned from those successes, as well as his failures, that have enabled him to have an inherent understanding of the information he looks for from a startup before making important investment decisions. Because many of these early stage companies have little to no data that would guide his decision making. With 10 years in the venture industry, Bruce has met with thousands of companies, all with very smart people, smart ideas, but a majority of them failed. In fact, the failure rates were incredibly high.
It's something around 80-85% overall. If you take a look at the companies focused purely in B2C, it's even higher.
This compelled Bruce to dive deeper into the why behind the lack of successes, which was the springboard to developing his book, Traversing the Traction Gap.
And I took a look at my own personal scorecard around the companies I invested in and the companies that went on to succeed. And I realized, between the companies where I was an operating executive and ones that I had invested in, I had a pretty good track record coming out of this. Certainly not this 80% failure rate. It was more around, at this point, probably around a 40-50% failure rate, so less. But the ones that succeeded, 1 out of every 4 companies, and this doesn't include the companies that I work for as a startup, 1 out of every 4 companies I've invested in have gone on to become billion-dollar successes. And so I began to say, well, why? What's the difference between the companies succeed and the ones that fail? And can't we explain and explore the reasons behind these massive failure rates? And if we can, why don't we put together, or why don't I put together something that lets us explain to entrepreneurs what they need to do? And at the end of the day, as I really looked at this and did a lot of research in preparation to write the book, what I realized was that if we're gonna prevent these massive failures, we have to be able to give people guidelines. We have to give them metrics. We have to where in these early stages where there's very little market data, very little metrics that we can evaluate to be able to help companies succeed. What are the other signposts that we might look at? What are the signals that we might evaluate? What are the proxies for revenue and the metrics that we would be taught in an MBA program? So I decided to look into this, and this is prior to the formation of Wildcat. I began to examine this, and what I realized is that what really separates the winners from the losers is really not product engineering. It's almost every company we've invested in, every product that I've attempted to build, my teams have attempted to build, we've actually built them. They work. They technically work. It doesn't mean they worked in the commercial market, but it meant that the product did what we intended it to do. So what is the fundamental difference? And what I realized was that there were a set of activities that were likely innate to the founders of these companies. And I began to document what those innate qualities were. Things like category creation, the understanding that if you're going to go out, you've got to either create a category from scratch and install yourself as the category leader by defining yourself into the role, or taking an existing category and redefining it in new attributes and forcing others to compare themselves against you. Thought leadership, other elements, and thought leadership is writing the books, the blog posts, the conferences, etc. Storytelling, the ability to be an epic storyteller. Epic storytellers are Steve Jobs. He's the classic, which is he distorts the reality field that we live in to make us believe something new can happen that's exciting. And market positioning, market messaging, etc. These are all elements that really distinguished the winning teams from the teams that didn't win.
From Bruce's in-depth research, he realized what separated winners from losers wasn't the product engineering. In fact, it's what he simply calls market engineering.
I finally came up with that term on a long walk that I was taking. That I said, all these companies, they are great at product engineering, but what they don't realize is that they have to, at the same time, engineer a market. And so that's where I came up with a term called market engineering and market engineers. And while Steve Jobs and Tom Siebel and Larry Ellison and Mark Benioff and on would never classify themselves as market engineers, I argue that this is what really defined their company. They had those innate market engineering skills, thought leadership, category creation, storytelling, messaging, etc., while also having technical chops. And so these are just innate talents that were brought forth. And so I brought with me the makings, at least the nascent outline of this concept called a traction gap framework. And the traction gap framework is basically just a way to deconstruct the process that people have to go through from ideation and taking those ideas, converting those ideas and concepts into a prototype and then a product, polishing it up into a minimum viable product, and then bringing that to market and to describe the steps that others have taken in order to go through that process. It's about guardrails, signposts that you can see in a time when there's very murky evidence of a market, very little proxy. You have to find other proxies for revenue or other proxies for usage or et cetera. If we read the lean startup books, et cetera, we'll understand better how to organize our company internally. If we read Jeffrey Moore's book, we'll understand more about how to look at the markets, visionaries, mass majorities, and what do we do to attract those different market segments. We need a book, or we needed concepts that we could internally and with our team and with others about what do we need to do to attract investors. There's really never been a book or a framework that's really focused on that element. And so that's what I wanted to expose through the framework itself and through the book. I decided to do this for several reasons. One is that if we wrote the book on it and we propagated these principles that have been tried, tested, and proven, well, first, we could help entrepreneurs be more successful. And in the process of helping them be more successful, we could then create a brand around Wildcat Venture Partners. And on top of that, we could bring those principles into the general ecosystem through universities, through accelerators, et cetera, and perhaps generate a name and a brand for Wildcat Venture Partners faster than we could if we just waited for the outcome of our companies to be successful, because I didn't want to wait around 7 years for that. I wanted to make sure that we were kind of out in the forefront right away. As a new emerging venture firm, how do we compete against well-known established venture firms? We have a marketing challenge, right? There's some great names out there, people, companies and firms that have been around for decades and have built very, very powerful brands. They're the Sequoias and the Benchmarks, Excels, the Andreessens, et cetera. So what could we do other than put up a website that says, hey, we're a bunch of smart people, we have capital, and look at all the value that we will add to your company? What could we do that would differentiate ourselves? That's what compelled me to write the book, was massive failures in the ecosystem compared against myself and my two other partners, where we have relatively significant success rates. I did it to give back in one way, and another way in order to develop a brand around Wildcat Venture Partners.
As Bruce shared, the Traction Gap framework is about how to take an idea, turn that idea into an offering, take that offering to market, and then once you're in market, ensure it successfully scales. Think of it as a methodology, one that helps early stage companies build a foundation for success. And a foundational principle of this framework is the notion of performing market engineering tasks to get to market product fit. Because without a market, there is no need for your product. It provides target metrics, strategies, and tactics that early stage startups can use to guide them through the crucial go-to-market phase, the phase where, as Bruce will tell us, most companies die.
The traction gap framework is really broken into three distinct phases. And it's three distinct phases because every product must go through these phases. There is the go-to-product phase. That's we come up with an idea, we might do a little bit of market research, we develop a prototype, and then we try to reach an initial product that we can bring into the market. We might call it an alpha or a beta. And then we polish that thing up and we reach minimum viable product. Now, this concept is well trod area, right? I mean, we've got Steve Blank, Eric Ries have kind of taught us how to get outside the four walls, execute a lean startup, and reach product market fit. That's the goal of the go-to-product phase. Get to product market fit. Let's jump to the third phase. The third phase is, hey, you got the product in the market, everything seems to be working. The business model has been established. I've got customers. Hey, things are going pretty well. Now I'm worried about first world order problems. Things like, okay, well, I want to take it out of the geographies that we're in and move them into new ones. I want to add new product features. I got a whole bunch of other things I want to worry about. That's the go to scale phase. That's phase 3. It's the in-between phase, phase 2, the go-to-market phase. This is the place where most products die. And startups are basically single product companies. Therefore, if you take a look at a lot of research from MIT Sloan, University of Michigan, et cetera, they'll show you that almost out of all products, not just products created by startups, but all products, roughly 80% of those products fail in the market. And the primary reason for this, through that research and other research that's been performed, is no market need. With the traction gap framework is to describe these three phases, the go-to-product, go-to-market, go-to-scale, identify value inflection points that you need to reach in order to dramatically reduce risk. That is, prove that the product that you've brought to market has value, and that to generate awareness and interest from investors, people who you want to attract to invest in your company. What evidence do you have that you have generated traction? And so this go-to-market phase is the traction gap, and it's in this traction gap that roughly 80-85% of all products, all startups fail. And the fundamental reason for that failure is generally, as we talked about earlier, not due to product engineering issues. It's generally due to lack of market engineering skill within the team. So the traction gap framework describes a set of value inflection points through these three phases.
Think of these value inflection points that Bruce mentioned as essentially subphases, specifically in the go-to-product and primarily in the go-to-market phase. They represent critical moments in time for a startup. These 5 value inflection points are: first, minimum viable category, MVC; second, initial product release, IPR; third, minimum viable product, MVP; fourth, minimum viable repeatability, MVR; and finally, minimum viable traction, MVT. As a startup successfully reaches each milestone, there's a dramatic increase in the value of the startup as a result of reducing market, technical, execution, and team risk.
So the first value inflection point that you're going to try to reach is called minimum viable category. This is have we identified a new category or an existing category that we want to own? Are we going to redefine it? What are we going to redefine it as? Or if it's a new category, what's the name of the category? What are the attributes of the category? How do I install myself as the category king into this category? So that's minimum viable category. Then from there, we go on to reach initial product release.
This is the point at which the product, often a beta version, first becomes available to the public and to the target users. At this stage, the team is seeking market and customer validation metrics.
From there, we go on to minimum viable product.
The MVP is the most pared down version of a product that customers are willing to purchase or use. It marks the first moment at which you have in your hands the raw version of what you believe can be a successful product.
Then another point in time is called minimum viable repeatability. That's where we've built multiple versions of the product. We've brought it to market. We've sold it multiple times. We're beginning to get a sense of what our business model may look like. Pricing, sales cycle, response rates, what new features we're going to build. We've hired multiple people. We've developed some systems to help us sell and market the product. And so the business is beginning to prove to be viable. And then finally, we reach this point called minimum viable traction. And the way that I like to explain minimum viable traction is it's about 12, maybe 18 months after minimum viable repeatability. When you go to the venture capital industry, instead of you selling them on your concept and idea, they're selling you why you should take their capital. This point of MVT is, I think it's a very visceral point in time for most entrepreneurs. Turns out there's actual real metrics against this. We did research across 60, 70 companies, CEOs, founders, etc. And there's an amount of time and there's an amount of amount of revenue, at least if you're looking at a B2B SaaS model, that you need to be on if you want to hit these points. And so the traction gap period from initial product release to MVT, minimum viable traction, is about 3 years. Not my numbers. Those are numbers that, you're competing against these 60, 70 public SaaS companies that have gone before you. So these are the numbers that they scratched out. These are the numbers that you're going to have to hit in order to make investors interested in you. And so that can be from when you declare, when you've got an initial product release, you get about 6 months to reach MVP. From MVP, you get about a year and a half to reach MVR, minimum viable, and that's about $2 million of annual recurring revenue. And then about 12, 18 months later, you need to be at about 6 million of ARR, about 500K of MRR. Those are the revenue numbers for MVT, MVR, MVP, and IPR. And again, about 3-year period of time. And if you're not on this revenue slope, if you're not hitting these numbers, then you're off model. You're off, and being off model means you may not be able to raise any capital at all. Or if you do, it's going to be at diminished valuations. And therefore, you're going to be giving up the soul of your company, equity, to investors because you were not able to be on track with what other very successful companies have done. Some companies have done way better. Slack, for instance, has done far better than what I just described. But what I'm giving you are the median values extracted from the S1s and other research that we did in order to assess where you need to be at these moments in time, these value inflection points. We're all familiar with product market fit, but I try to get people to think different. The truth of the matter is, I think all entrepreneurs should really begin to think about market product fit. Without a market, there's no need for your product. And so it's a simple twist on words, but I think it has a lot of nuance to it. And
totally agree. Having worked as the marketer with product teams and working back and forth to understand who is not just the audience, which is one of those things we have the back and forth on, but what category are we operating in and who is the competition? It's all that necessary strategic homework to really understand what is that opportunity prior to already going into defining, the features and the functionality and then subsequently the roadmap and starting to operationalize all of that. But without that fundamental understanding up front, I've seen it fail several times, having worked with startups as well as larger stage companies too, in the products that they look to put to market.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The problem is that most of these teams, as we said earlier, is that with them, they have strong product engineering skills. Vast majority of them at this stage, for sure. As we found, is that product engineering are just table stakes. It's really market engineering that's going to distinguish between whether you succeed or fail. And one of the only elements that's within your control in this whole process is when you declare MVP. When you declare MVP, you're on the clock now. You're on the investor clock. They're watching, well, how fast is your revenue? How many customers are you acquiring? How many users are using your product? Before you declare MVP, while you may be burning capital, et cetera, you're not on that sort of on that clock that becomes super important, and you will be compared against others as how you do. These market engineering skills, the first thing that teams need to recognize is that they have to look at market product fit. They have to decide, is there really a market? Have you done any research? How much research? Is it relevant research? Is it contextually relevant, et cetera? What's the sample size of that research? You need to make sure that the category, just as much effort as you put into thinking about the features of your product, you have to also examine the features of your market, the attributes. What do you want the world as it currently exists? You want to transform that world into a new world, a world where your product is being used. Well, why? What are the key attributes of that? And spending the time and energy on this is part of that minimum viable category work. And I would argue that one of the bigger mistakes that most teams make is declaring MVP before that work is done. Mm-hmm. And they also make another mistake, and they think this is the role of a marketer or a PR person, et cetera. But that is absolutely not true. It is the role of the team, the CEO, founders, co-founders, other executives in the startup. Their job is to do the market engineering work for several purposes. One is because you learn a lot from doing this work, and you may decide to abandon the strategy that you thought you were taking, because if you perform the work well, you're going to learn a lot. And you're going to learn, you're going to iterate on product features, but you may also iterate on your positioning. You're going to iterate on the category name. Maybe it doesn't really accurately or adequately define who you are and what you do and differentiate yourself. Before you declare MVP, just as you have confidence that the product features are ones that the market is going to want, you also have to make sure that the category is a market or is one that is going to be accepted by the market. So this is, I think, a big opportunity for teams in terms of where they spend their effort and understanding what the elements of market engineering are and what needs to happen during this phase, I think are super critical. And if I like I said earlier, if you really kind of strip away all the things that made certain companies succeed while others did not, it really comes down to the best market engineers win. Not always. In some markets, it's really technology, but I would say 90% of the time, it's market engineering.
No matter what phase, size, or maturity a startup may be in, there are 4 core architectural pillars, essentially foundational building blocks of an enterprise, that every startup needs to continuously measure, refine, and optimize. These pillars are product architecture, revenue architecture, teams, and systems architecture. And they have different levels of emphasis across these 5 value inflection points.
Fundamental elements that are part of this that I call the architectural pillars. That's those pillars are product, revenue, team, and systems. These become important aspects because at different points in time, they take there's different things that you need to do to accomplish them. And it's just a taxonomy that I created to be able to say, okay, what are the primary, or what are at least 4 elements? There could be others that are introduced, but I tried to make, again, as simple as possible in order to put the work that people need to do into buckets at different phases. And you're right. At different moments in the company's maturity life cycle, these different pillars take a point of prominence. In the go-to-product phase, you're primarily worried about, strangely enough, product. And there's a lot of emphasis on reaching market product fit, identifying whether you've got enough statistical evidence that if you build a product with this particular feature set, that it actually will satisfy a large part of that market that you're trying to go after.
A startup's product architecture entails a set of technologies, applications, and features that make up its offerings. And this is where early-stage startups tend to have the most detailed plans, not surprisingly, given their traditional product engineering focus.
within revenue architecture is really, it encompasses a number of different things. It encompasses your pricing model. It encompasses your marketing and sales motions. One of the problems that I always see is that a lot of people, they push this off, this concept of coming up with pricing and what the sales motion is going to be. They push it into between MVP and minimum viable repeatability, or MVR. And so without even having at least a point of view on how much do you think it's going to take? What are we going to spend to acquire a customer? What are we going to spend to keep a customer? How are we going to make sure that, what type of gross margins are we going to hit? What is the conversion rate from top of the funnel down to bottom of the funnel? All this stuff is unknown at this point in time, but at least to have a point of view. We seem to have, every team seems to be able to accurately describe what the product architecture is going to be. We're using microservices on the back end. We're going to run on top of AWS. We're going to use React as our front end, and we're going to use a variety of different tool sets in the form of Jira or other things to be able to sort of bolt it all together. So they can accurately describe that, but then when you talk about, okay, so tell me about what are you going to use for your to acquire customers? Are you going to use an account-based marketing? Is it going to be self-service? How is it going to work? How are you engineering all of that? At least what's your expected cost of acquiring a customer, and how are you going to make sure that you over time reduce that cost? I typically get like 30 slides in an investor deck, and 28 of them are about the product and the market, and very well defined, very, very well understood way in which the company's going to build a product and why they're building it. The slide 30 is always the ask slide. Hey, this is what we want: $200K for seed or pre-seed. $5 million an A, whatever it is. And slide 29 is what I affectionately call the "a miracle occurs" slide, because this is where the finance slide is. It shows you that up and right histogram of users or revenue or whatever it's going to be. But we've been talking about that market engineering is really what differentiates, not product engineering. Why don't we have 28 slides on market engineering and what at least the assumptions of what it's going to cost to acquire and retain these companies? Because in the end, you are basically the product of your business model. And at least having an understanding of how much it's going to cost to acquire a customer will tell you how much capital you're going to need to reach these value inflection points. And I kind of go through the math of this in the book. So product architecture is critical, but revenue architecture is also extremely critical. And then we have team architecture, which is, okay, how are we going to build our team? Who do we need first? Who do we need second? Where are they going to be located? What's the culture of our company going to be from day one? One of the things that I learned doing all the interviews is every single CEO that we interviewed, I thought product was going to be like number one issue. It was team. Toxic team members, dysfunctional decision making, inability to hire, unwillingness to fire. I mean, amazing. Every one of them. And so I would argue that of the four pillars, team architecture is really foremost. It's the one that matters from ideation into perpetuity. And so if I were to actually redraw the way that I have in the book, I have a figure about the four squares of product, revenue, team, and systems that are all tied together. I actually might redraw this into make it a circular graphic with team in the middle, surrounded by product, revenue, and systems, because it became so evident that team members and team dynamics are really what make or break. We're not investing in biotech, right? That's where these are really science experiments, with a few people, scientists basically deciding if they can create some kind of molecule, et cetera. In this case, we have people who have to all work together with different skill sets. And so team becomes super important.
You had a quote in there, I believe it was about the truism about this need to hire slow and fire fast, because it is about the people. The people are what make the product and make the experience, and finding the right combination of those individuals is so important, but is something that isn't necessarily emphasized because people are focusing a lot more on the end thing versus the individuals that really make the engine run at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what happens also is, these are friends, right? These are people who we know really well. We're working long hours together. We get to know each other really well, get to know our families really well, et cetera. And so if somebody's not working out, and working out it means many different things. But if they're not working out, then the CEO, and this usually falls, unfortunately, upon the shoulders of the CEO needs to make these decisions much more quickly, because, like I said, every day is sort of, we're burning up a lot of capital. Most expensive capital you will ever raise is at this moment in time, and these early days. And so the longer that you wait, the more that you jeopardize the success of the startup. And unfortunately, it's about the success of the startup, not about really the success of the individual in that group. And we have to make these decisions. I agree. It's not really talked a lot about, which is why I wanted to put some time and effort into discussing it in the book. And then finally, systems, not just systems like technical systems like Salesforce or Marketo or whatever to run the business, but systems of governance. How are we going to make decisions in the company? When are we going to meet? When does the exec team meet? How do we make those decisions? How do we hire? How do we fire? And are those expressed in written documentation? So when the next person who comes on board, they understand, well, it's not just a bunch of stuff I pin up in my cubicle. It's actually how we operate as a company. And every CEO we met with also said, from day one, the ones that were successful tried to establish a culture from day one and then develop that into systems of governance. So those are the 4 architectural pillars. And as I said, they exist from the moment that you decide to put together a company into perpetuity. The different things may take forms of prominence. So maybe in the go to product phase, it's really around product. Maybe in the go-to-market phase, it's around revenue. And as you move to go to scale, it's about the systems that you install that become more important to allow you to scale. And then underneath all that, team. So those are the 4 elements. And in the book, in every chapter, the way that I wrote the book is it kind of goes chronologically from ideation all the way through MBT. And we try to define and show you how much emphasis you need to spend on any particular architectural pillar in that particular phase of your company.
A critical point that Bruce makes in his book is that for each Traction Gap milestone, for example, the MVC, MVR, or MVT phase, you have to satisfy the revenue, product, team, and system requirements associated with that specific milestone before moving to the next. And directly from his book, he says, quote, failure to do so can and often does lead to excessive delays and use of capital, thereby significantly compromising your ability to reach the next value inflection point with the amount of capital in the bank. And failure to reach that next value inflection point on your current capital can substantially compromise your ability to raise any future capital. Unquote. Fundamentally, implementing this framework in practice involves ensuring you have that market-first mindset. And that entails capturing and monitoring market signals, continuously measuring and testing, and making data-driven product decisions. To do so, you have to develop what Bruce calls your market IQ to truly get a complete view of the market, which is particularly important early on in the initial product release phase. He explains.
So this notion of becoming market first includes this concept of developing market IQ, as well as the notion of solving problems, identifying what the real root problem is, and what might be potential solutions that are either augmentation to what we currently have, or maybe something entirely different. And unfortunately, I find that most of the time we don't really give ourselves the opportunity to explore the root cause problems. And instead, what we try to do is take what we currently have and kind of build a solution off of that. And that leads to a lot of product failure as well. Market IQ is this process of becoming intelligent about the market. And a market first mindset is to have a North Star. It's very challenging to do this because while we may all have an appetite for data, we don't have appetite for waiting on the data. And one of the biggest impediments that we've always had in especially in the technology industry is that we don't really want to wait. We don't want to wait 9 months for a market research study that comes back to prove that what our ideas were actually viable, because we're terrified that another company is going to come along and actually build something, deliver it, and beat us out. If you take a look at it, if we have a set of customers, that customer set, those are the group of people who believe what we believe, who purchase this product that we've created, but by no means represent the entire market. In fact, I would argue, obviously, in these early days, it's a fractional part of the market. The overall market consists of mostly of people who haven't bought your product, who haven't heard of your product, who don't know that your product exists. And so the way that I like to polarize this conversation is that if you're a customer-centric, if you're a customer-led company or a customer-centric product company, that's great, but you're only addressing the people who live in your echo chamber. You need to listen to all the people who haven't yet bought your product and understand why not. Understand what features they need. Understand the reasons that they've chosen not to buy from your particular company and maybe from a competitive offering. To me, the North Star concept here is becoming a market-first company. That is, a market-first company is first and foremost concerned about what the market thinks about the products and services that you are building. Within that market-first concept are your customers, and you need to worry about your customers because that's going to affect your churn rates. That's a bottom of the funnel problem. You need to worry about them, you need to please them, etc. But if you only build feature sets for your current customers, you're ignoring all those other companies that have yet to purchase your product. And I would argue that is a fallacious way to run the company. The second piece of this about market IQ is that, remember, if we're building something truly unique, if we're bringing a new product into the market, we're building a new category, there's probably very few actual signals being who's looking for your product. If we went out and evaluated all the search terms that are being looked at right now, they may not be looking for your particular offering, primarily because nothing like your offering exists. And so consequently, there's not a lot of evidence for you to go off of in terms of signals, whether those are revenue signals, whether those are search term signals, et cetera. And so we have to find other proxies for signals in these early phases. And those signals come through things like discovery interviews, things like surveys. Discovery interviews are primarily qualitative in nature. Surveys are primarily quantitative in nature. We need to make sure that the sampling, that the sample sets that we're using are sufficient to draw accurate market conclusions. One of the biggest issues that teams are faced with is confirmational bias. If you do research, if you understand the elements of research, as a statistical researcher, one of the things that you have to eliminate is confirmational bias, and that's one of the bigger problems that we fall prey to. Certainly in Silicon Valley, is that we're smart, we know what's best, we know what the market wants, and so when we get these market signals that are contradictory to what we may believe, we tend to reject them. And because there isn't enough evidence, this actually really happens between, let's say, the CEO and maybe the product management engineering team. Maybe the product managers think that they ought to be building something because they've talked to a bunch of different people. The CEO doesn't like it and then just rejects it out of hand, so we're not going to build it. And it's hard for the product organization to refute it because they don't have the data to refute it. So the net of this is that market IQ is what are the tasks? What are we doing in order to ensure that we are that there is a market, that in the market that the specific feature sets and issues that, or the things that we're trying to address, really are important. They're must-have versus nice-to-have. Do we have enough data to prove it? Have we performed 100 discovery interviews with companies, with people at different levels in those companies across multiple industries? Is there enough evidence through this research to suggest that the product that we want to build is actually a product that the market wants, not just maybe a few customers. And we need to do this in a way, we need to be able to do it fairly quickly.
There are several cost-effective ways to continuously capture these market signals in order to build this all-important market intelligence. And that may include methods such as discovery interviews, usability tests, smoke tests, and customer support data. Painting this comprehensive view isn't only limited to startups either, because many don't build a depth of market intelligence for their products. So why did this lack of discipline around really understanding the market occur?
When we created agile development, we really revved up the velocity of delivering new product to market, and for a lot of really good reasons. But in the process, we broke planning, and in fact, we also turned product managers into project managers. I mean, if you have a 3-week sprint and you've got a lot of work to get done for that sprint, there's not a lot of time to do a lot of the work that we just talked about, right? And then even if we do, the amount of time that we have because of this agile development issue, we've broken the planning process, And so I'll throw a plug in for a company I personally started and funded called OBO, OBO, OBO.PM. It's designed for product managers, product marketers, engineering, et cetera, to be able to get this kind of validated research done really fast. And then to collaborate and iterate and compare different points of view, sales, marketing, customers, non-customers, and to do that cross-cohort comparison fast to identify what are the feature sets that we really should be focused on for this particular release, because we've got to retire some technical debt. We got to make sure that this big customer needs these features, and not all engineers are the same engineer. So we got to be able to make these trade-offs. And there's never been anything like this kind of an application in the market.
Another important end benefit of the Traction Gap framework is that it also creates a shared language that can help align everyone involved as to what stage they are at with their business.
Learning about this philosophy and understanding around market engineering is so compelling, being a product marketer myself, and having a language now for me to continue to bridge the gap with other folks who are more technically oriented potentially. You're learning to speak one another's language. So by creating this framework and methodology, certainly see that you've now provided this common vernacular for which everybody can become better aligned and understand those critical milestones along the way.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the best outcomes of this is exactly what you just pointed out, Connie. I think the ability to have a shorthand, and by the way, the shorthand exists between ourselves and entrepreneurs. This framework is easy to articulate, easy to grasp for entrepreneurs. And the idea is that we can pick up this language, we can pick up the concepts really fast and then begin to use them. So we find this to be a really fast shorthand with entrepreneurs for us to discuss, well, where are you in your maturity life cycle as a company? What things do you need to work on? But it also serves as an investment decision model that we use within our own team to make both an initial investment decision plus downstream reinvestment decisions. And then finally, it works really well with our limited partners, those firms that invest in us to invest in startups. And it's a way for us to explain, well, here's where we invested at this moment in time. Here's what it's called. And it allows us to tell our limited partners, hey, look, this is where we invested and this is where this company is now. And within the framework, they know what things we're going to have, what this company is going to focus on, what things we can expect to report on, and are they on model or off model? And maybe one of the most important things that comes out of all of this is that I've grown rather weary of watching companies explain their maturity in terms of the financing round that they last had. We're a Series A company or Series B company or C, whatever it is. This nomenclature that has evolved over the last 50 years is really a very, very poor proxy to determine anything. The fact that you raise capital is interesting, but it really doesn't tell the investor much of anything about where you really are. We're an investor in a database company, Bill and I, and the truth of the matter is we're probably on our Series D. They're the fourth professional round in the company, and only recently reached MVP. Well, minimum viable product. Well, why is that? Well, it's because it's a database company. It's not a mobile app, and requires a lot of capital and a lot of time in order to be able to solve a lot of fundamental problems that you have to solve for computer science problems. That if you don't have all of them solved in a database, no one's going to buy your product. If you can't store records on the disk, you're in trouble. So unlike an application where you may not have all the features that you necessarily want. So one of the things that I hope for sure, is that if we can adopt this traction gap terminology as an entire ecosystem, whether it's limited partners, general partners, and entrepreneurs, or university students who want to become entrepreneurs or venture capitalists, the benefit would be that we're actually describing companies in terms of where they really are. How much more capital are they going to require to get to another value inflection point? How much time do they have? What should the gross margins be, et cetera? And all of this is encapsulated in the metrics that are documented now within this framework. So now we have some guideposts, some guidelines that we can operate against. And by us having shared language, it gives us the ability to communicate much more effectively, much more quickly, much more efficiently, and in a time, especially at a time in these early stages, every day matters. We're burning tons of capital it can be potentially irrecoverable. So we have to make sure that every day we spend that capital as wisely as we can.
The power of this framework isn't limited to startups only. In fact, it could be a very powerful tool for large enterprises, as they also have their own innovation arms that are intended to operate like startups.
One of the things that resonated with me is I could also see it being applied not just to startups, but having worked with larger enterprise businesses that have a innovation type of arm, or we've got various entrepreneurs, I should say, who are building new compelling technologies. It's a framework that's very much applicable to them.
Let me just address also this idea about large companies, because I think you're spot on. So one of my partners here at Wildcat, although he's not an investing partner, he is our strategic partner and involved in our firm, is Jeffrey Moore. And many people probably have read a few of his books. Certainly, probably Crossing the Chasm might come to mind. He currently serves as Mark Benioff's sort of a strategist and several other technology firms in the Valley and outside the Valley. So it's great to have Jeff as a partner, and he's one of the people who encouraged me to write this book. The reason I bring this up is one of his most recent books is called Zone to Win, and it's based upon this concept that large companies, when they come under attack from new products, basically because of people like me investing in new ideas and startups, those large companies resort to sort of looking inside the organization to see if they have an answer to these new products. And typically it comes from a lab, or it comes from a skunkworks group, or et cetera. And what we usually do is take those products and throw them into what Jeff would call the performance zone, the group that is generating the most amount, the sales organization, the marketing organization, et cetera, that's generating most of the revenue for the company. And this usually mucks up the works. So, and many people who have experienced this problem over and over again, I know I have. And so Jeff came up with this concept that you got a performance zone, you got a productivity zone. This zone is the group that supports the performance zone. And you've got this incubation zone. We would all know that as the skunkworks group or the labs group or et cetera. And Jeff said, why don't we organize around that? And instead of throwing the stuff in the incubation zone directly into the performance zone, why don't we transform it through this transformation zone, a virtual group of people come together, legal, sales, marketing, service support, look at the new product offering and go, wow, we're going to have to fix this, this, and this, or we're going to have these kind of legal documents or this kind of marketing collateral, et cetera. And that group is responsible in a virtual way of readying that incubated product so it's ready for the performance zone. makes a lot of sense. Developed it actually in conjunction with Salesforce and Mark Benioff. So why that, that long sort of wind up on this is that incubation zone is a startup. That startup, whether, it's that team of people, engineers, product managers, product marketers, et cetera, this traction gap framework is ideally suited for that incubation zone. So if you are a product person inside of a large company bringing a new product to market, you are going to have to go through the phases that we describe in the traction gap framework.
Your experience and your desire to work from the problem space of understanding why many startups failed that drove you to ultimately create this solution to help them be more successful. So to close, you have any last words of wisdom?
I think that we all should strive to become market engineers. The more of us who do this, I think we'll find greater success rates. And the more success rates that we have with early stage companies, the more capital will be made available to early stage companies through limited partners and general partners. So I think it's incredibly important for us to think about the market engineering process and for us to become the market engineers. That is the leadership of these teams. This is not marketing. It's market engineering. And so marketing can be part of it, but market engineering requires the team to do this. The other thing that people and entrepreneurs should think about, and a big mistake that's commonly made, is that you really need to complete minimum viable category work before you declare MVP. This work, I think it is critical. It will make or break your company. And so do not go beyond MVC until you complete those tasks, and certainly not beyond. Do not declare MVP until you have achieved MVC. And so a lot of times this means teams need to go back and fix these problems. The other thing is, another big mistake that teams make is that they bolt on marketing and sales resources when they declare MVP. And the problem with that is that at this stage, the management team should be the sales and marketing team. You really need the insights of everybody who comes with a different point of view before you bolt on that big carburetor that sucks in a lot of fuel into that four-banger that you're running. This is where you can burn up a lot of capital and not make a lot of progress in terms of revenue. And if this kneecaps many, many companies. So resist the tendency to bolt on big sales. You can add a sales, a director of sales or a VP of sales. You can add a director of marketing or VP of marketing, but don't add a big team underneath this, because those people are going to invent language. They're going to invent your positioning. They're also going to be a filter between you and what the customer or prospect and the market is really saying. You don't want to do that. And then finally, I know it's challenging, but please do market research. Please invest in this. I mean, I made an advertisement for my company, Ovo. It doesn't matter. Do the research. Do the work. You may think it's expensive. You may think it takes some time, but you really need to place time and energy on performing adequate market research before you build anything, because the cost of not doing it is so great. And so if you can follow just those things, and I guess every business book only has a couple of things that we take away from them. Hopefully, if you read the book, these will be the things that will sort of pop out at you. And I hope that they are helpful to you and give you the ability to go on and scale and become, a successful, notable company that we can all look at and go, wow, wish we were part of that team.
And knowing what you know now, what advice would you impart on your younger self?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that I personally did myself a disservice by, again, listening to myself and a few people versus actually listening to the market. And I would do more of that, do more of this upfront research on building and delivering products. But the other part is actually something that I think I did well. And I don't exactly know how I came to make this decision. But I decided that I would learn from the very best before I tried to go off and do, something, relatively on my own. And I would encourage most people that are either thinking about doing, becoming an entrepreneur, et cetera. I would encourage you to embed yourself in a company that currently exists that is doing really well, a market leading company. There's just these different traits of market leaders that you need to sort of look at, understand, absorb before you ever go do a company. I would argue start with a big company that's successful and work your way down in your career. So by the time you're 35, 40, you've already got 15 years of experience and understand and have seen and worked within winners. And by working within winners, you know what it takes to then win yourself. I know a lot of young people who want to start a company from sort of scratch. I would advise, if that's what you're passionate about, great. But if you have the opportunity, kind of work your way down, start larger and work your way downward, because you're going to learn a lot from those experiences.
Right. It gives you a lot of very good data points that helps you build that intuition like you had, where it helped you ultimately, write this book because you intuitively knew what those necessary elements were that could build a great company. And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
So I write frequently on Medium. It's under the Wildcat Ventures moniker. I post a lot in LinkedIn, and I try to connect with everybody who wants to connect with me. Just don't, one of the things, just don't try to sell me something right off. And don't try to sell me on your company right away. Tell me a little bit more about it, what you're doing, what you're thinking about, et cetera. These are relationships, right, that you want to form. And don't squander LinkedIn, which is a fantastic application for business relationships. Don't squander it by looking at it as an opportunity to sell somebody something. Look at it as a way to get to know somebody. And then, over time, that relationship can turn into potentially an investment. I try to meet with as many people as possible. So, and my email is bcleveland, like the city, at wildcat.vc. So you're welcome to email me. And if you're in the area and I have time, I try to get together with as many people as I can. So that's the best way to reach me, is through those two methods. And again, if I can't do it, it's not because I don't want to. It's because my schedule's fairly involved.
You're a very busy man. Well, thank you so much for sharing this valuable methodology that will help startups fundamentally increase their success rate, but really giving people a common language to better understand how to create that necessary traction.
Great. I've been happy to be part of this, and it's been enjoyable talking with you, Connie.
Thank you.
What separates a successful startup from those that fail isn't product engineering. To traverse the traction gap, it takes engineering a market, which requires you and your team to develop that all-important market IQ. You have to achieve market product fit, because without a market, there's no need for your product. And as Bruce says, the team architecture is central to a company's success. So making sure you have the right players and optimal team dynamics early and throughout every phase of your startup is crucial. And this approach is certainly not exclusive to startups. Enterprises can also leverage the Traction Gap framework to take an idea to market and ensuring it successfully scales. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. For a visual overview of the Traction Gap framework, as well as a summary of the key points Bruce outlined in this episode, please visit the show notes for this page at strategicmomentum.co/episodes/60, or simply type Bruce into the search bar. To connect with Bruce, follow him on Medium at medium.com/@bcleveland, or send him a request on LinkedIn. You can also email him directly at bcleveland@wildcat.vc. If you like what you heard, please share this episode with at least one person who you think could benefit from learning how to help their early stage company increase their rate of success. And please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.